Hello everyone, welcome to the first video in a tutorial series on my approaches to sculpting rocks in zBrush. Thank you for taking an interest in this course. I hope you enjoy it. Okay, let's get started. Initially, I'd like to start by looking at a reference image. This is a still image which I have captured from a Bon Iver music video. The music video is shot in Iceland. And you can see the rocks in the foreground of the reference image have quite a distinct shape to them. I think it's important for me to mention that part of this tutorial is a little bit about me exploring some of these techniques myself and learning how to do some of these things myself. So this reference image was purely something that grabbed my attention at the very beginning. It was very important for me to start the sculpting process in zBrush rather than starting with another mesh created in another 3D software already and then importing that into zBrush. I wanted to start sculpting from directly in zBrush. And so the rock in that reference image just caught my attention, and I thought I'd have a go at that. Plus there's a bunch of nice other little detail on that rock. So there's some moss and there's dirt, and you can see there's areas where there seems to be quite a lot of moisture in that environment. So it's likely that there's areas where the rocks are slightly damp and whatnot. But I thought that would make an exciting challenge trying to have a go at that rock anyway. So jumping straight into zBrush, and we'll start by selecting the polysphere in the light box and then dragging that out onto the canvas. It's very important that you press T as soon as you've done that to enable the 3D editing mode. Another thing that I found incredibly useful was starting to create shortcuts for brushes. This is very easy thing to do, but learning the shortcuts of brushes and then creating a couple of your own shortcuts really helps speed up your sculpting workflow. So you can see there I am selecting the move brush by hitting the B key to open up the brush palette, then the M key to navigate to the move brushes, and then the V key to select the move brush. And from there, I'm just going to start pulling our polysphere into a slightly rockier shape. And bearing in mind that reference that I had earlier, kind of an almost pyramidal, triangular shaped rock, I'm going to start just pushing the shape around until I start to see something interesting and start to see something that resembles, a little bit more closely resembles the reference. Okay, at this point I'm coming into the geometry menu and then navigating down to the Dynamesh portion of the menu, and the goal is that we're going to try and get an appropriate resolution to be sculpting at. I didn't want to sculpt at too high a level of detail initially. I just wanted to create a basic shape at a slightly lower resolution. So we're going to start playing with the Dynamesh to try to achieve the appropriate mesh resolution. And you can see that Dynamesh resolution slider is very sensitive, but also a little bit unpredictable, so sometimes it helps to just play with it a little bit. Okay, I don't feel like I've explained that very well, so let's just have a look at a completely fresh example. So we've got a clean ZBrush scene, and we're just going to drag out a polysphere onto the canvas, hit the T key to enter the 3D edit. Let's just push our bracket keys to increase the brush size, and then I'm just going to drag some brush strokes out onto the sphere. And you can kind of get a sense of its default resolution there. Then we're going to come down to the geometry tab, over to the geometry tab, and navigate to Dynamesh. We're going to hit Dynamesh, and it's going to ask us if we're sure we want to do this, because by default the polysphere has multiple subdivision levels, and when we Dynamesh it, that's going to kill the lower levels of subdivision. So we're just going to say yes, and the mesh will be Dynameshed, which you can see at a very low resolution. Then I'm also going to hit Control D in order to further subdivide this mesh, and you can see that smooth out a little bit. And then I'm just going to turn on the polyframe. So you can see the wireframe of the mesh, and you can see now that that's been Dynameshed. Now I'm going to change the Dynamesh resolution and control click and drag, and you'll notice that absolutely nothing happens. However, if we now come over to the mesh and add any slightly small change to the mesh, for example, one single little brush stroke as I'm doing now, and then control click and drag again, you'll see that it does then calculate that Dynamesh. And you need that small change in order for it to recognize that it needs to do something in terms of the Dynamesh. So if I turn the resolution right down, control click and drag, nothing happens once again. I come back in, make a tiny change to the mesh, control click and drag, and there you go. You can see that it recalculates that. So it took me a little while to understand that was how the Dynameshing worked, but once you do, obviously you have a huge amount of control over the kind of precision you're going to get from the Dynameshing operation. Okay, going back to our main rock example now. Okay, you can see here that I'm also using the Z-Remesher tool to control the resolution and kind of remesh this shape. But to be honest, with the technique that I went over with the polysphere a moment ago, you probably don't really need to do this. You can get a very reasonable, accurate adjustment to the poly count using the Dynamesh tool. As we are in our Dynamesh mode, and we start moving and pushing those polys around to get the shape that we're looking for, every time we feel like we've stretched the polys too far, we can just control left click and drag in the viewport, and that will remesh it for us. And that's something that's going to happen when that Dynamesh button is active over on the right hand side. So you can see now I'm just trying to pull it roughly into the shape that we might have been able to see in the reference image. And also just examining the silhouettes from a couple different angles and trying to create something that I think is interesting. Obviously we've only got one view on the reference image, so we're not going to create something exactly identical. But this process can be quite fun and quite enjoyable and fairly kind of free form in nature. Okay, now that I've got a shape that I'm largely content with, just an overall blob mash shape, I'm going to add resolution to this mesh. So we're going to subdivide the mesh and then come through and Dynamesh it again. So to do that, I go over to the Geometry tab and hit the divide key. So you can see now we have two levels of subdivision. And then I'm just going to tweak my Dynamesh settings again, just to make sure that when I do Dynamesh it, we get a decent resolution there. Okay, so I have now also selected the clay build-up brush, and same again as with the move brush, the way to do that is to hit B to bring up the brush palette, and then C to bring up the clay brushes, and then B to bring up the clay build-up brush. So just with 3 keys you can get to that brush really quickly. Okay, and from here I am basically just going to attack this shape with the clay build-up brush. You can see I've also added a square alpha into the alpha slot of that brush, and that's just going to help give that clay build-up a little bit more of an angular shape to each of the brush strokes. But the idea is basically to just create a general texture to the whole surface of the rock. So I'm just spending a little bit of time trying to find the appropriate resolution there, with exactly the same process of Dynameshing and then tweaking the mesh resolution that I described earlier. And now that I feel like I've got a decent resolution that I can start actually adding detail to, I'm going to start working into this mesh. And bearing in mind that when you're having a go at the mesh like this, a regular brush stroke will raise up with this clay build-up brush. A regular brush stroke will raise up the surface of the mesh, whereas when you hold the Alt key down, it'll start to push into the mesh and indent the mesh. So all I'm really doing with this process is looking at the characteristics that I've created with this rock already, just with the very basic shapes using the move brush, and now I'm trying to add texture and maybe exaggerate some of those, and accentuate certain spaces and accentuate certain indentations or ridges on the rock itself to try and just to try and give a little bit more shape and texture. There's no real method to this madness. Honestly, it's mostly just fun, just kind of having a go at it and seeing what the brush does, and trying to create a lot of texture. We're going to use another brush later on called the Trim Smooth Borders brush, and all of this texture that we create will really help set that brush off. It'll really help it to perform well and give some fairly exciting results based on all of these completely random normals that we're creating now. And I'll speed this portion of the video up so that you don't have to watch me going through this whole process. One thing that was quite important for me with this whole rock sculpting exercise was to try and get more into ZBrush in a more fun way. So being a little bit freeform with it, and I think that's one of the nice things about the subject of rocks, is it's not, it's not an incredibly precise hard surface exercise. So, if you spend a lot of time during your day trying to be incredibly precise and accurate with things, this kind of exercise in ZBrush can be quite liberating and quite fun, because there don't have to be loads and loads of crazy rules. You can be a little bit more free with it and a little bit more expressive and actually make something with your hands. It's quite fun. Okay, now I'm just going to start having a go at the underside of this rock, knowing that it is going to be the underside of the rock. I'm really not spending too much time on it, so you can see there's probably some slightly obviously regular patterns there, but that's okay. I just want to add some rough texture to it so that our Trim Smooth Borders brush has something to play with, and then also once we get to texturing much later on down the line, there'll be lots of detail and irregularity in the mesh. That Substance Painter has something to play with and something to work with. I think it's important to try and have fun with this part of the process. ZBrush really becomes a lot more enjoyable and a lot more fun when you just kind of jump in and start attacking the model, bearing in mind that you can always Dynamesh it, you can always remesh it. It's important to not be overly precious, I think. So I think having roughed up the whole surface of the rock now, I'm probably coming in just a little bit closer and trying to accentuate certain slightly smaller details. So now I'm just going to save the tool, and then I'll probably also save the project, and then we'll call it there, and I'll see you in the next lesson.